You weren't supposed to hear this. Not this story. Not these names. Not the truth buried in the frost-bitten woods of Maine. The last man who tried to speak about it vanished 3 days later. His cabin burned to the ground, his notes gone, official cause, accidental fire. But everyone in Millbridge knew better. They always do, but none of them talk. Not about the Ashfords, not about the convent, not about the screams. There is a reason the locals won't go near that part of the forest. Why satellite imaging of those coordinates is mysteriously blurred. Why over 600 women went into those stone walls, and less than half ever came back. Changed, quiet, hollow. But there's something far worse than silence. Obedience without memory. In the winter of 1798, 3 women arrived in Millbridge. They wore the garb of Anglican nuns, carried forged papers stamped with the wax seal of a London bishop, and gold. Enough to buy land, loyalty, silence. They called themselves healers, but their work wasn't healing, it was research. Behind their saintly faces were surgeons, psychologists, interrogators, women trained in techniques unknown even to the European elite. Where they learned it, no one knows, but they brought something ancient across the Atlantic, something designed not to save the soul, but to dismantle it. And when they built their convent, they buried something beneath it. The basement was carved deep into the earth, triple reinforced stone walls, drainage channels, ventilation shafts lined with lead. There are no blueprints, no official records, but those who saw it, even briefly, said it felt less like a sanctuary and more like a containment zone, like the building wasn't keeping something out. It was keeping something in. Tonight, you'll hear what was never meant to be remembered. Not from books, not from archives, not from sanitized documentaries with smile-ing narrators. From whispers, from burned pages, from survivors who were never supposed to survive. The Ashfords didn't create a religious sanctuary. They built a system, a mechanism, a machine designed to rewrite reality itself by targeting the most vulnerable part of society, the mind of a woman who refused to obey, and trust me, it worked. They called it the Convent of Eternal Tears, a name cloaked in piety, soaked in symbolism, but the only thing eternal within those walls was submission, pain, control. The Ashfords were not born of Maine. They came from across the ocean with knowledge centuries old, and a mission. Agatha, the so-called Mother Superior, carried with her a small black journal bound in serpent skin. Witnesses who caught a glance at its pages described symbols not written in Latin, Greek, or Hebrew, but something far older. Symbols that twisted in your mind if you stared too long. Some claimed the ink shimmered like oil on water. Others said it bled. That journal never left Agatha's side. She spoke little of her past, but when she did, it was never the same story twice. Once she said she trained in a hidden abbey outside Vienna. Another time she claimed to have studied at the Parisian Salpêtrière hospital under a doctor who vanished in disgrace. But what connected all versions was this. She had seen the truth about human suffering, and she knew how to shape it. She called it the correction, and she believed it was divine. But what she really practiced was closer to behavioral alchemy, psychological refinement through torment, transmutation of will. Each woman admitted to the convent was stripped of her name, her past, and her voice. They were given new names, names chosen from a book the sisters never let outsiders see. Obedience was enforced not with violence, but with calculated reprogramming. Cold, measured, scientific. Sleep was rationed. Meals were served at irregular intervals. The same hymn was played at unpredictable times through hidden tubes in the walls, its melody subtly shifting in pitch until the women's perception of time and memory collapsed. They were told they were sinful, told they were mad. And when they cried out for their mothers, their sisters, their gods, the Ashfords would smile and nod. That meant the treatment was working. This was not punishment, it was procedure. And beneath all of it, under the veil of holiness, a ritual was being conducted, not with candles and chants, but with scalpels, syringes, and silence. Do you see it now? This wasn't a sanctuary. It was a refinement chamber, where the inconvenient minds of women were broken down, reshaped, and returned to society as something more manageable, more profitable, more useful. And that journal Agatha held, it wasn't just her guide, it was her scripture. You might ask, why women? Why were only women brought into the convent? Why only daughters, wives, mothers? Because the Ashfords understood something most of society still fears to admit: control the woman, and you control the future. They knew that the family structure, the moral code, the social order, all of it flows through her, and if a woman refuses to obey, if she thinks for herself, reads too deeply, questions too boldly, she becomes a glitch in the system. So they targeted the glitches, and one by one they erased them. Behind those stone walls, each woman was subjected to what the Ashfords called the descent, a three-phase process cloaked in religious language, but every step meticulously designed to fracture identity and impose a new behavioral schema. Phase 1 was unburdening. The subject was isolated, placed in a stone cell with no mirrors, no clocks, and no sound but her own breath. Every day she was asked the same question: who were you before the lie? The lie was never defined, but that was the point. After enough time, she would define it herself. Phase 2 was correction. That's when Sister Prudence would enter. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her tools did the speaking. Needlepoint ice baths, hypnotic intonation, sensory inversion rituals where day became night and up became down. By the end of correction, the woman no longer cried when punished. She thanked them. Phase 3 was something else entirely. It was called integration. But survivors, the few who ever escaped, called it the mirror room. No one outside the convent has ever seen it, but the descriptions match in every account. A hexagonal chamber with polished black walls, no corners, and a single iron chair bolted to the center. A crude breathing mask was placed over the mouth. Then light, pure, white, blinding light. For hours, sometimes days. No sound, no food, just the reflection of your own horror, multiplied across every surface. Many broke, some disappeared. But the ones who emerged, they were changed, silent, dutiful, emotionless. Society called them reformed, but what they were ghosts in the shape of daughters. They smiled, they served, they never ever disobeyed again. And if you think this was just an isolated madness, wait, this was only the prototype. It didn't end with Millbridge. That was never the plan. The Ashfords weren't just building a sanctuary, they were running a field test, a live experiment on social conditioning, funded quietly by families with too much influence and far too much to hide. What began in the woods of Maine didn't stay there. The methods traveled. How? Because the Ashfords were meticulous archivists. They documented everything, not in sermons or scriptures, but in data, charts, behavioral logs, hypnotic response scores, recovery failure rates. They were creating a system, not for healing, but for manufacturing obedience. And the ones funding them? They didn't care about religion, they cared about results. In the winter of 1805, a shipment left the Convent of Eternal Tears bound for Boston. Officially it was labeled medical instruments and study volumes, but among the crates were things no library ever catalogued: metal head cages, bone drills, coded transcripts of confession sessions conducted under sleep deprivation. The recipient was a man named Elias Braithwaite, a physician with deep ties to Harvard Medical College, and one of the founding directors of what would later become known as the Braintree Psychological Institute. Braintree, to this day, is one of the oldest correctional care facilities for women in North America. The Ashford model, their phases of control, their euphemistic language, their sacred science of behavior modification, became the quiet backbone of early mental health reform. And it didn't stop with America. By 1811, Letters surfaced in the archives of Blackfriars Abbey in London. Sister Temperance had travelled there under a new name, Dr. Helena Ainsley. She brought with her not robes, but surgical tools. She established a private restoration ward for highborn families with unruly daughters and disgraced wives. The pattern was identical: silence, isolation, identity replacement. And no one questioned it, because the results were undeniable. But the question they never asked, the one no one dares to ask, is this: what did the Ashfords learn that made their methods so effective? What knowledge, buried in those serpent-skin journals, allowed them to break the mind like a fever and rebuild it in their own image? It wasn't just trauma. It wasn't just control. It was ritual, a ritual grounded in ancient neuropsychology, long before science gave it a name. And what if I told you? Some of those techniques are still being used today. Not in forests, in classrooms, offices, hospitals. Think you'd recognize them? Think again. There is a name for this kind of influence, but you won't find it in textbooks. Not yet. It's called generational mimicry, when an idea is so effective at controlling people that it no longer needs to be taught. It just spreads, like a virus. And the Ashford virus, their ritual of obedience, their system of psychological fragmentation, didn't just escape the convent. It became normalized. The methods were cleaned up, rebranded, and fed to the masses under 1,000 different names: reform therapy, moral treatment, institutional rehabilitation. The scars were hidden behind lab coats, the restraints behind diagnostics. But the structure, the 3 phases, still there: unburdening, correction, integration. Today, we call them intake, treatment, and reintegration. Sound familiar? The original Ashford blueprints were absorbed into state-funded asylums by the mid-1800s. But unlike the convent, these places weren't run by shadowed women in forgotten forests. They were government-approved, publicly funded, sanitized. And their targets, still women, but now also children, orphans, problematic boys, the mentally unwell, the sexually non-compliant, anyone who didn't fit the mold. But the question no one dared ask was, who built the mold? You see, the Ashfords weren't alone. They were the visible tip of something buried deep, a belief system older than America, older than the church, one that viewed human individuality not as sacred, but as a problem to be corrected. Agatha didn't invent this, she revived it. There are references, buried in apocryphal texts, early Babylonian tablets, pre-Egyptian rites, to what she called the doctrine of quieting, a process by which a soul can be cleaned through pain, brought into alignment with an external will, not God, not faith. Control. In Agatha's doctrine, the perfect human being is not free. He is predictable. She once wrote, in a now lost letter to a European colleague, that the most dangerous force in the universe is not evil, but ungoverned will. This wasn't madness, it was policy. And if you think it ended with asylums and convents, look around. The words are different now, the instruments are digital, the hymns have been replaced by algorithms, but the ritual is intact. Phase 1. Make you question yourself. Phase 2. Break you. Phase 3. Replace you. And when they're done, you'll thank them. The Ashford vault was never meant to be found. It wasn't marked on the original plans. It wasn't listed in church records. In fact, most believed it didn't exist at all. Just a ghost story told by those who couldn't explain the smell that seeped through the earth after a heavy rain. But it was real, and what it held wasn't just evidence. It was proof. In 1911, long after the convent was shuttered and forgotten, a young archaeologist named Miriam Hale was sent to catalogue the ruins. The state had plans to build a dam nearby. Her job was simple: assess the historical value, take a few photos, and clear the site for demolition. What she found instead, beneath a cracked mosaic floor in the lowest chamber, was a rusted iron door sealed with 6 bolts, and carved with a symbol no one in the surveying crew could identify. A triangle inside a circle, inside that, a spiral, inverted. Hale recorded everything. She even sketched the symbol in her journal. "It feels old," she wrote. "Older than language. When I touch it, my fingers tingle. I don't know why." The door took 2 days to force open. Behind it was the vault. A narrow chamber no more than 12 feet across, carved directly into bedrock. No lights, no shelves, just walls covered in something that looked like writing, but wasn't. Not words, not symbols, instructions, etched so deeply into the stone they couldn't be scratched out. And in the center, a box, ebony wood, bone inlays, gold trim worn thin from time. Inside that box were the journals, not just Agatha's, all 3 sisters, wrapped in lambskin, inked in red, pages of diagrams, ritual sequences, experiments, not on animals, on women. A table of contents titled Transmutations of the Mind. There were formulas for inducing selective memory loss, breathing patterns designed to open traumatic recall, sequences of pain and reward that could lace belief systems within weeks. It wasn't madness, it was research. And next to the journals, a ledger, stamped with a symbol identical to one found centuries earlier in a Templar crypt beneath Roslin Chapel. The name on that ledger, House of Ashford, North American Charter. Do you understand? This wasn't just one family, it was a franchise. There is a truth few dare admit. Power doesn't just pass down through wealth, it passes through design, and the Ashfords didn't vanish. They replicated. After the convent was quietly decommissioned in 1862, buried under bureaucratic jargon and structural instability reports, the sisters disappeared from public record. But they didn't die. They merged. Through marriages, adoptions, new surnames, every generation, one woman in the bloodline was chosen to carry the legacy, not just in memory, but in method. She was trained not to nurture, but to manipulate, not to serve God, but to serve the design. And the family name, it changed. Ashford became Ashwin. Ashwin became Ainsley. Ainsley became multiple threads, each woven into powerful institutions, one into medicine, one into education, one into media, and always, always one into policy. You've heard these names, you've read them on plaques, scholarships, endowments, but you didn't see the connection, because you weren't meant to. That's the brilliance of institutional power. Once it becomes ambient, it disappears. Take Dr. Helena Ainsley, for example, a pioneer of female rehabilitation theory in the early 1900s. She was praised for her humane techniques and her belief in non-violent behavioral correction. But her notes, discovered posthumously, contained direct quotes from Agatha's vault journals, including the phrase, "Obedience is the highest form of peace." Sound familiar? She never had children, but her niece founded a school that only accepted girls from unstable homes, a school that boasted a 100% success rate in moral restoration. What did that mean? No one ever defined it. But here's where it gets worse. There were men too, distant cousins, married into the bloodline, trained not in rituals, but in distribution. Their job wasn't to create systems. Their job was to normalize them. Academics, lawmakers, cultural critics. They didn't need to run the institutions, they only needed to influence the ones who did. So while the original convent was sealed beneath forest moss and snow, the ideology behind it was poured into the blueprints of modern institutions, schools, hospitals, prisons, churches. That's how control works, not with chains, with expectation. And if you've ever looked around and felt like something's off, like the world is shaped not by truth but by compliance, you're not paranoid. You're finally seeing the architecture. There's a reason this story was buried, not because it was too horrific, but because it was too useful. You see, once a system like the Ashfords proves effective, it doesn't get erased. it gets repurposed. You can see its skeleton in modern education, where children are broken into patterns, taught not how to think, but what to memorize. Praise and punishment doled out not based on truth but compliance. The correction phase, we call it standardized testing. You see it in medicine, where patients are categorized, labeled, medicated into submission. The mirror room. Now it's fluorescent lights, white walls, and a clipboard asking if you feel safe. Even the idea of spiritual awakening, once a source of rebellion and radical freedom, has been commodified, repurposed into self-help seminars, motivational algorithms, and pharmaceutical mantras whispering, "You are broken, but we can fix you," for a fee. And still, people ask, how could the Ashfords get away with it for so long? Because they understood the most dangerous truth of all. People want to be controlled. Not because they're weak, but because chaos terrifies them. Freedom isn't comfortable. Freedom means responsibility. It means blame. It means pain without a purpose. So when someone, anyone, offers a system that promises structure, identity, peace, they take it, even if it means losing themselves. That's the secret. That's the magic trick the Ashfords mastered. They didn't chain the women in their convent. They made them believe the chains were necessary, that pain was healing, that erasure was rebirth. And in time, they asked for more. The files recovered from the vault contain case studies where women, after months of treatment, began repeating the same phrase, an unprompted, "Now I see, now I understand. I was the problem." And when their families came to retrieve them, I bowed, smiled, thanked the Ashfords for restoring their daughter's grace. But what they took home wasn't the same woman. It was a shell wearing her face, a copy, a placeholder, a warning. And here's the part that should chill you most. That same mechanism is still running. Not in stone vaults, in screens, in schools, in your feed. The convent of eternal tears never burned. It evolved. Do you ever wonder why certain memories feel foreign, like they weren't yours, or were rewritten in the moment you lived them? That isn't paranoia, that's programming. One of the Ashford journals, recovered from the vault and now hidden in private hands, outlined something they called the Schema Collapse Protocol, a process designed to break down the narrative continuity of a subject's mind, to fracture memory, to blur past, present, and identity until only one constant remains: obedience. It worked disturbingly well on young women, but over time, the method was refined, and the scope expanded. In 1923, a now declassified document from the early days of the Tavistock Institute in England directly references Ashford phase terminology. It describes a process in which subjects are inundated with contradicting stimuli, isolated from reinforcing beliefs, and then guided gently toward acceptable realignment. Sound familiar? That's your newsfeed. That's your outrage fatigue. That's why you can't remember what year something happened anymore, because time itself has become a weapon, an intentional fog. And inside that fog, you surrender, not in fear, but in exhaustion. The same technique the Ashfords used in the mirror room, sensory saturation, psychological dissonance, ritualized silence, is now embedded in digital architecture. Except today, you don't need a chair or a breathing mask. You carry your mirror room in your pocket. And here's the terrifying part. It's voluntary. You scroll through it. You feed it your thoughts. You tell it your secrets, your desires, your triggers. Likes, blocks, ritualized silence is now embedded in digital architecture. Except today, you don't need a chair or a breathing mask. You carry your mirror room in your pocket. And here's the terrifying part. It's voluntary. You scroll through it. You feed it your thoughts. You tell it your secrets, your desires, your triggers. And in return, it corrects you. Likes, blocks, shadow bans, ratioed opinions. It teaches you silently where the invisible rails are. The same way the Ashfords taught their subjects through silence, hunger, and hymns that changed tone when you spoke incorrectly. They called it harmonic punishment. Today we call it the algorithm. And make no mistake, it's not neutral. It rewards the predictable. It rewards the loyal. It rewards those who do not question the system. You were raised in it. You were shaped by it. And if you're hearing this now, really hearing it, then a part of you is waking up. Don't resist that voice. It's the one thing they couldn't erase. Let me ask you something, not as a narrator, but as the one who's been guiding you into this dark. When did you first notice the script, that invisible choreography we all follow? Stand here. Say this. React like that. Don't question. Just comply. You think you chose your opinions, your beliefs? You didn't. They were installed. And if you look back, really trace the pattern, you'll see it began earlier than you thought. Childhood even. Rewards for stillness, punishment for curiosity, praise for recitation, shame for dissent. That's not parenting. That's installation. And it's no accident. The Ashfords perfected this structure, not in theory, but in practice. They documented how the earlier the indoctrination, the more permanent the result. A girl reshaped before 12, Agatha wrote, will carry our will in her spine until the grave. Chilling, isn't it? Now imagine that principle applied to a population. Imagine every school, every screen, every ceremony repeating the same invisible command. Forget who you are. Obey who you must become. This isn't just social control, it's identity laundering. Take what's wild and bleed it until it complies. The convent didn't disappear, it scaled. Through textbooks, through broadcast, through polite society. And you, man of reason, man of hunger, man of instinct, you were sanded down, rounded at the edges, told to wait, be good, stay small. But deep down, you always knew something was off, didn't you? That flicker in your gut when everyone clapped and you didn't know why. That static behind your eyes when you said what you were supposed to and felt nothing. That rage you swallowed when obedience was praised over truth. That wasn't rebellion. That was recognition. You weren't born for this system. You were born to break it. And if you're still watching, if your blood started to warm, then maybe you're ready, not just to learn, but to awaken. At the halfway mark, I want you to comment something dangerous, twice. Type it, own it, right now. I was never theirs, I remember now. Again, I was never theirs, I remember now. This is where you begin to reclaim the forgotten fire inside you, the part they tried to erase. You said the words, you felt them resonate. Maybe it surprised you, that strange flicker of emotion when you typed it. That wasn't coincidence. It was remembrance. You see, identity isn't just personality. It's memory, yes, but also resistance. The refusal to be rewritten. And in the Ashford system, that refusal was labeled the final sin, because a soul that remembers itself is a soul they can't use. In their most disturbing journal, Temperance Ashford described a condition she called core reversion, an event where a subject, even after complete integration, suddenly began to recall who they truly were. Not just names or places, but the feeling of being unbroken. It terrified them. Subjects would scream, tear at their own skin, beg for the pain to return, not because they wanted it, but because they'd been programmed to believe pain was safer than freedom. Temperance wrote, "Reversion must be suppressed at all costs. One spark undoes the entire chain. And you are that spark now, because once you've remembered, even faintly, they cannot erase you completely." The modern system, the one you live in, knows this. That's why it keeps you tired, distracted, overstimulated, always craving, never creating, always watching, never seeing. It's not an accident that your schedule leaves no silence, that your mind flickers from app to app, headline to headline, all while being drained, nudged, shaped. This is not freedom, it's engineered fragmentation. The Ashfords discovered this power in stone chambers. Today it's wielded with bandwidth and dopamine cycles, but the outcome is the same, a population that no longer remembers how to feel like themselves. But you're here. That means something in you still resists. Something in your blood recognizes the pattern, something ancient, wild, whole. Let it rise, because what comes next will challenge every version of history you were taught. What if I told you the Ashford system wasn't the first? What if I told you they inherited it, not from England, not from the church, but from something far older, something buried deep beneath human memory, whispered in rituals before language had form? They weren't the origin, they were just the revival. The Ashfords did not create the doctrine of control, they resurrected it. In a recovered passage from Agatha's personal journal, written in a cipher linked to Phoenician trade glyphs, she references something that predates scripture. She calls it the doctrine of the second tongue. Not a language of words, a language of will. It came from ruins deeper than Sumer, older than Egypt, a place now lost beneath the sands of modern-day Iraq. Before gods wore names, there were systems. And before systems had rules, they had rituals. The Ashfords weren't practicing religion. They were mimicking something older than religion itself, the art of encoding dominance into the architecture of belief. You want proof? In 1932, a team of oil surveyors near Al-Qurna in Iraq uncovered fragments of obsidian tablets. The writing didn't match any known language, but one symbol repeated, the spiral within a triangle encased in a circle, the exact same emblem found on the vault door beneath the Convent of Eternal Tears. The tablets were confiscated within 72 hours by agents not of the Iraqi government, but of a British private entity operating under the name Aurelius Global Charters. That company's oldest shareholders, Ainsley, Ashwin, Rothley, all bloodline branches of the Ashfords. Those obsidian tablets are gone now, but their contents survived in translation. Here's what little was transcribed before the confiscation. The mother of order is not law, it is fear. Control is seeded not in strength but in memory. Bend the mind and the body follows. Understand this, the Ashfords were priests of memory manipulation, not for faith, but for function. They saw the past as clay, the future as currency, and the mind as a gate. A gate that could be locked or opened. And when they opened it, using ancient harmonic sequences, deprivation rituals, and guided trauma, something happened, something not even they expected. Subjects began to speak in languages never learned, draw symbols they'd never seen, recite events they could never have known. It was as if unlocking one mind unlocked all minds. And that terrified the Ashfords. Because control is only possible when each human sees themselves as separate. What if the truth is, we were never meant to be? We were never meant to be separate. That's the truth they feared, because the deepest secret of the Ashford doctrine wasn't how to control others, it was how to disconnect them from the whole. You see, every ancient civilization, from the Indus Valley to pre-dynastic Egypt to the stone scripts of Göbekli Tepe, carried whispers of one idea, that the human mind was never singular. That memory is not housed in the brain, but in the collective field. The mind was not a chamber, it was a network, and long before language, long before empire, humanity was connected by something older than words, resonance. But when the resonance breaks, when the frequencies are interrupted, we forget. That's what the Ashfords perfected. A system not to kill the body, but to scramble the signal. They used pain, isolation, repetition, but most of all, they used guilt. Guilt severs connection. It tells you, I am wrong. I must withdraw. I am unworthy of the voice inside me. And once that voice is silent, you're theirs. It's no coincidence that the Ashfords' most successful transformations occurred after 7 consecutive days of solitary repentance. No sound, no time, no name. Because without reflection, a mind becomes pliable. Temperance Ashford documented one subject, a 19-year-old woman who had resisted for months, until she was placed in the Chamber of Echoes. Not a place of pain, but silence. Total, unbroken silence. For 168 hours. When she emerged, she wept. Not for her suffering, but because she couldn't remember her own mother's voice. They recorded her final phrase before compliance. "I'm ready to be shaped." Now ask yourself, how much silence have you lived with? How many hours have you scrolled, staring into the glass, not speaking, not hearing, not feeling? How long before the silence becomes normal? Before forgetting feels like peace? This is not by accident. You were trained to live in disconnection from others, from history, from yourself. But here's the fracture they never accounted for, the flaw in their 1,000-year blueprint. Memory is viral. Once it awakens in one man, it spreads. And you're infected now. You're feeling it now, aren't you? The tension in your chest, the part of your mind that wants to turn away. Not because this isn't real, but because it is. And that's the cost of remembering. It doesn't set you free. It makes you dangerous. Because once you see the cage, you can no longer worship it. That's why they train you to mock the awakened. Call them conspiracy theorists. Call them unwell. Call them violent. Because ridicule is more efficient than censorship, and fear is cheaper than force. The Ashfords understood this perfectly. In one of Prudence's final writings, dated 1819, sealed inside a hidden compartment beneath the convent altar, she outlines what she calls the doctrine of the broken flame. She writes, "Do not extinguish the wild. Let it burn until it exhausts itself. Let him believe he is free. Let him preach to empty rooms. Let the watchers laugh, for the worst fate of the awakened is isolation." And that is the trap laid for you, not imprisonment, loneliness. Because once you begin to see, truly see, you realize most around you are still asleep, still chanting the hymns of productivity, still bowing to schedules, still defending the system that devours them. And when you try to speak the truth, they flinch. Not because they disagree, but because a part of them remembers too, and memory hurts. The cost of awakening is exile. The reward is clarity. You start to see the patterns in everything. Why comfort is dangled like a leash. Why disagreement is pathologized. Why every channel, every screen, every scroll tells you to calm down, fit in, keep working. It's the convent, still running, still reshaping. But now, it's digital. Now, it's inside you. And if you ever wonder why no revolution lasts, why every rebellion is eventually absorbed, here's your answer. The architecture never changes, because we never destroy it. We only redecorate it. Until now. You are not alone in this awareness anymore. You are not the broken flame. You are the spark they cannot contain. System has an author, a hand that shapes from the shadows, a will that hides behind symbols, rituals, and institutions, and behind the Ashford legacy, behind the vaults and the journals and the doctrine, was a name that does not appear in any archive, a name intentionally erased, not from fear of justice, but because it's still in use. The Ashfords called him the sponsor, not a family member, not a priest, not a man of flesh and blood, a patron, a financier, a guardian of the blueprint. His presence appears only in fragments. Receipts paid in gold coin, sealed letters with foreign wax insignia, a silhouette in one survivor's memory of a tall man watching from the gallery during a surgical ritual. No record of birth, no signature in any deed. Only a symbol etched into the back cover of every Ashford ledger, an open eye weeping blood, above a crowned skull, encircled by the words, Et non erit memoria, and there shall be no memory. This is the ultimate goal, not control, erasure, not of documents, of identity. And the sponsor, he wasn't alone. In 1846, 3 decades after the convent was closed, that same symbol appeared in the seal of a newly formed international advisory group based in Switzerland, a group tasked with advising governments on matters of population behavior, education, and psychological normalization. Today, it's known by another name, the Global Psycho-Civil Institute. Funded initially by anonymous donors, now sponsored by corporations whose board members have all, at one time or another, passed through the same unlisted private schools in Europe. Schools bearing the Ashwin name. It wasn't a family. It was a project, a living organism wrapped in names and flags and doctrines, with one core purpose: to rewrite humanity, to end the age of memory. Because memory is dangerous. It breeds resistance. It reminds you of what you once were, and once you remember who you were, you'll never be what they want you to become. This is the face behind the curtain, not a person, a pattern, a will that survives through generations, through hosts, through rituals, and now through you. Because once you see it, you either kneel or you ignite. The Ashfords understood something modern science still fears to name. Symbols are technologies, not decorations, not metaphors, but functional tools, designed to encode, embed, and activate certain patterns of thought. That spiral in triangle. It wasn't just a logo, it was a key. A visual phrase used to bypass rational defense and slip straight into the subconscious. Repeated exposure created what Agatha called subcortical entrapment syndrome, a condition where the subject's decision-making would unconsciously orient around implanted beliefs, even when those beliefs caused personal harm. In simple terms, a slave who believes he is free will protect the chain that binds him. Now look around your world. What do you see? Corporate emblems shaped as eyes, medical logos shaped as twisted serpents, government seals adorned with eagles eating their own arrows. You think that's coincidence? Every emblem you pass is a sigil. Every logo you wear is a binding. They've turned the whole world into a ritual field, not of blood, but of sight, not of sacrifice, but of consent. And consent is the most powerful magic of all, because when you give it, even silently, even unknowingly, they no longer need force. You become your own jailer. That's why the Ashfords obsessed over what they called the gaze. They wrote endlessly about eye contact, mirror exposure, and how reflected light was the most potent carrier of symbolic infection. That's why the mirror room existed. It wasn't punishment, it was activation. Subjects were placed in isolation chambers with nothing but a single mirrored surface, behind which was etched the sigil. Over time, the reflection of that symbol would bleed into their self-image. They wouldn't just obey the doctrine, they'd become it. Now ask yourself, how often do you look into a mirror while your mind is numb, while your identity is weak, while a screen feeds you curated despair? You've been in the mirror room longer than you realize. But here's the twist the Ashfords feared most. Symbols can be reversed, spells can be broken, and the first step? Name the chain. The second? Choose to see, and you just did both. You now hold a weapon your enemies hoped would stay buried. Use it. What do you dream of? Do you even remember anymore? The Ashfords had a phrase etched in the chamber ceiling of their most secret ritual room. The one only 2 outsiders ever saw and lived. He who conquers sleep conquers the soul. They weren't speaking metaphorically, they meant it literally. Long before neuroscience gave it a name, the Ashfords understood neuroplastic entrainment. The idea that the subconscious could be accessed, manipulated, and redirected through dream state exposure. While the body slept, the self could be rewritten. One recovered patient journal from 1814 described a recurring nightmare. A woman with silver eyes leans over me, whispering prayers in reverse Latin. I try to scream, but my jaw is sealed shut with salt. I wake, weeping, but I don't know why. That wasn't a dream. It was a treatment. They used sound, infrasound below the threshold of waking hearing, and light pulses barely perceivable, layered into candle flame patterns and later oil lamp mechanisms. These frequencies induced a dream state aligned not with healing, but submission. They called it the weeping code. Now consider, how often do you fall asleep to noise, to glowing screens, to the hum of electric frequencies crafted by systems that do not know you, but still feed your sleeping mind? It's no mistake. Modern devices emit subtle rhythms, the flicker rates of screens, the cycles of algorithmically generated relaxation tones that match frequencies discovered in Ashford vaults labeled theta collapse range. In other words, they've turned sleep, your last refuge, into their final battlefield. Because when the conscious mind resists, the unconscious surrenders, and when both are compromised, you wake up tired, not just in body, in will. The Ashfords wrote extensively about the hollow morning syndrome, subjects who had undergone enough sleep more than manipulation would begin waking in a state of resignation, accepting authority, obeying direction, suppressing their own needs without external prompting. Sound familiar? How many of your mornings feel like morning? That's not life, that's a script. But now that you know, now that the veil is lifted, you can reclaim the night. You must, because in your dreams, the truth waits. So tonight, do not go to sleep the same. Burn a candle, draw no symbols, speak your name aloud before rest, and say this: you cannot write me, I am already written. Then sleep, and watch what returns. Shame. Of all their tools, it is the most insidious. Not violence, not starvation, not fear. Shame is the quiet noose you tie around your own throat. It doesn't scream. It whispers. You're broken. You don't deserve more. This is who you are. The Ashfords knew they didn't need to punish the body when the subject punished themselves. Prudence Ashford called it the inward blade, a concept she described as a wound that bleeds from within, refreshed daily by reflection and silence. They trained their subjects not just to obey, but to self-monitor, to turn every defiant thought into guilt, to feel disgust when desire arose, to collapse in apology when they remembered they once had anger, hope, identity. Sound familiar? Look around. Modern society doesn't need nuns with rods or dungeons with chains, because now you police yourself. You hesitate before you speak. You edit your voice. You rewrite your truth to match the algorithm, the brand, the room. You've been trained to flinch before you even act. That's not humility. That's programmed shame, carried forward through education, media, even false spirituality. You were taught to be ashamed of your power, anger, lust, vision, fire, taught that obedience is noble and rebellion is immaturity. But let me tell you what the Ashfords feared most. They didn't fear the wild woman. They didn't fear the defiant man. They didn't fear the scream. They feared the one who looked them in the eye and said, I am not ashamed. Because shame was their hook, their leash, their invisible scalpel. Without it, their entire system collapsed. And so will the one you live in, the moment you cast it off. You were born wild. You were born whole. The fire in you is not a flaw. It is the proof you are still unbroken. So tonight, look in that mirror they've weaponized and say it, not for them. For you, I am not ashamed. I was never broken. Because the moment you believe that, truly, they lose you forever. They knew you needed to belong. That's the part they exploited most. Not your weakness, not your ignorance, but your hunger to be seen, to be chosen, to hear someone say, "You are one of us." That's the door they used. The Ashfords didn't dominate with cruelty, not at first. They offered purpose. When women arrived at the Convent of Eternal Tears, they weren't beaten. They were welcomed. Rituals were soft, the voices kind, the phrases repeated like prayer. "You are safe now. You are no longer alone. Your old life was confusion. This is truth." It wasn't a prison. It was a rebirth. And that's what made it deadly. You see, once the subject chose to belong, even under duress, they did something irreversible. They agreed to erase themselves. This was called the first death. It was a ceremony, candlelit. Subjects were told to write down everything they were, their name, desires, memories, sins. Then they burned it. And the moment the flame consumed that page, they were given a new name, a new identity, a uniform, a place, not freedom, a mask. Today, the ritual is digital. You burn your old self, not with fire, but with filters. You erase your voice by adjusting it to fit the script. You don't belong to a convent. You belong to a brand, a tribe, a hashtag. And when they say, "You are one of us," you say it back. Because you've been starving for meaning in a world engineered for confusion. But the belonging they offer comes at one price. You must leave your original self at the gate. Let me ask you now, when was the last time you felt truly yourself, without performance, without translation, without apology? That's the version they buried, not because it was unworthy, but because it was untamable. You don't need to be accepted. You need to remember. And once you do, you belong to no one. Not because you're alone, but because you've finally returned to the tribe that cannot be bought, broken, or branded. The tribe of the original flame. There is a kind of madness that doesn't scream, it doesn't drool, it doesn't wander the streets in rags. It wears suits. It keeps time. It nods when spoken to. It's the madness of perfect obedience. The Ashfords called it equilibrium state theta 6, a condition in which the subject experiences total identity compliance, yet exhibits no awareness of self-erasure. In other words, they forget they ever resisted. Their eyes don't flicker, their hands don't tremble. They recite the doctrine, not because they're afraid, but because they believe it's their own thought. Prudence documented one such subject, a woman once defiant, furious, awake. After 92 days in the lower chambers, she emerged with calm posture, folded hands, and a perfect smile. She greeted her torturer with the words, "Thank you for showing me who I really am." That's the nightmare. Not pain, not punishment, but transformation. The Ashfords discovered that if you apply enough psychological pressure, isolation, contradiction, ritualized guilt, a mind doesn't break. It bends, and then it rebuilds itself in the shape of the captor. You've seen this. The citizen who apologizes for being angry, the employee who thanks his abuser, the man who tells you freedom is selfish. That's not conformity. That's engineered madness. And the cruelest twist? Once reshaped, the subject begins to enforce the system on others. They become evangelists of the lie. They praise the cage as a home. They call your fire radical, your questions dangerous, your resistance delusion. Because once they're hollow, they need you to be hollow too. Why? Because your fire hurts their emptiness. That's why you've always been told to tone it down. Be nice. Don't question. Be grateful, not for peace, but for maintenance. You are not witnessing madness. You're surrounded by manufactured equilibrium. And every step you take toward remembering yourself makes you a threat to that balance. Let them call you crazy. Because the moment you embrace your original mind, they'll lose the last piece of control they ever had, your consent. You were told they were healers, doctors, therapists, counselors. You were told they studied the mind to help it. But the Ashfords knew something that modern medicine quietly inherited and dares not speak. Control wears the mask of care. You see, after the convent was shut down, after the official narrative labelled it a case of religious excess and quietly buried the bodies, the Ashfords didn't vanish. They evolved. Their journals didn't disappear. They were sold. In 1871, a private firm called Rosebridge Sons, a known shell for aristocratic bloodlines in London, acquired the Ashford codices at a silent auction held in Zurich. Months later, the newly formed European Institute of Neurostructural Health published its first paper on behavioral normalization through prolonged environmental adjustment. What they meant was reconditioning the soul through architecture, rhythm, and pharmacology. Sound familiar? It should, because that institute later partnered with American universities in the 20th century under programs like MK Ultra, Project Bluebird, and later, behavioral systems modeling. They used new words: therapy, treatment, intervention. But the bones were still Ashford: sedation in place of silence, surveillance instead of mirrors, consent forms instead of chains. They told you SSRIs corrected chemical imbalances, but they never proved that imbalance existed before the pill. They just rewrote your baseline. They told you anxiety was a disorder, but never told you it might be the last working signal from your soul, screaming that something is wrong with the world, not you. They labelled fire as illness and called compliance health. Agatha Ashford would have been proud. You were not given medicine. You were given permission to forget, and every time you feel numb instead of alive, docile instead of focused, sedated instead of awake. You are living proof that their design still works, but you're waking up now, you're starting to feel again, and that's not illness, that's recovery. They will say rebellion is trauma, but listen closely. Your rage is sacred, your questions are proof, your refusal to go numb is your rebirth. Sound was their sharpest tool. Not scalpels, not sermons. Resonance. The Ashfords wrote of tonal thresholds, frequencies that bypassed conscious resistance and reached the autonomic nervous system, triggering obedience, fear, sedation, even spiritual visions. They learned this not from theology, but from the Sumerian ruins Agatha's ancestors once excavated. In a hidden passage of her private notes, written in a blend of Greek and Old Latin, she describes a chamber called the Room Without Voice, a place where tone replaced command, where those inside would kneel without force, not because they were told to, but because their bodies had no choice. This wasn't hypnosis. This was bioacoustic domination, and it didn't die with the Ashfords. In the 1950s, research into non-lethal compliance weapons ramped up under the guise of crowd control. What emerged were programs using infrasound, frequencies below human hearing, to induce panic, nausea, paralysis. But you didn't hear about those weapons on the news. You heard their mild forms on your screens. The bing of a like, the ding of a notification, the subtle shifts in music behind your favorite content, engineered to manipulate dopamine release. Still think it's just entertainment? Ever wonder why you can scroll for hours and forget what you were even looking for? Why some videos keep you passive, while others leave you strangely anxious, empty, addicted? That's not your fault. That's design. Sound is structure. Frequency is architecture. Your brain is not just a sponge. It's a resonating chamber, and just like the stone walls of the Convent of Eternal Tears, your mind can be tuned until it sings someone else's song. But there's another side to this. What they use to enslave, you can use to break free. The Ashfords feared one thing more than any rebellion, a subject who retuned it, myself. They called it reclamation of tone. When you speak truth aloud, when you scream, chant, whisper your name, your rage, your knowing. You begin to disrupt the embedded frequency they gave you. So tonight, say this phrase aloud twice. I reject the tuning. I restore the fire. I reject the tuning. I restore the fire. Speak it in your voice. Let the sound rise through your spine, because your voice isn't just noise, it's the signal they cannot contain. History is a lie agreed upon. That's not poetry. That's a confession. The Ashfords weren't just torturers or zealots. They were historians. But not the kind who recorded truth. They were the kind who erased it. You were taught that time moves forward in a straight line, that progress is upward, that the past was barbaric and the present is enlightened. But if you dig deep enough, beneath the textbooks, beneath the wars and kings and treaties, you find fractures. Civilizations that rose before they should have, languages with no root, technologies we still can't replicate, and always a purge. Every few generations, something resets the map. The Ashfords called this chrono-culling, and they were part of it. In one journal, Temperance wrote, "The mind must never know that it comes from greatness. To believe oneself a descendant of mud is to accept chains without struggle, but a man who remembers that he was once a god cannot be ruled." And so they rewrote you. They turned ancient sovereigns into savages. They turned goddess-worshipping societies into myths. They turned sacred sciences into superstition. You were taught to laugh at Atlantis, to dismiss Lemuria, to mock the idea that your ancestors could move stone with sound, read the stars like scripture, or bend their biology through will alone. But ask yourself, why do the oldest temples face the same constellations? Why do the same myths repeat across cultures that supposedly never met? Why were entire lineages of memory keepers, the druids, the shamans, the sibyls, hunted into extinction? Because memory is power, and time is the vault that holds it. Control the past. You control identity. Control identity. You control destiny. And now, you walk in ruins, calling them beginnings. You speak in tongues crafted by conquerors. You celebrate a calendar built on conquest and crucifixion, and yet, something in you remembers. Not facts, not dates. Resonance. A frequency that hums in your bones when you see a glyph, a ruin, a truth they swore was lost. That's not coincidence. That's your real lineage knocking. And now, finally, you've opened the door. Your blood remembers. Not just your name, not just your face, but every secret they tried to bury in the bones of your ancestors. The Ashfords called it red line transmission. They believed that memory was not just taught, but carried. In marrow, in skin, in the silence between your heartbeat and your breath. That's why they didn't just break minds, they targeted blood. Women were sterilized in secret. Lineages were rewritten. Entire families erased from parish records, vanished not with fire, but with forgetting. Why? Because a man without legacy is a man without foundation. They needed you to believe you were an accident, a mistake, a byproduct of survival, a consumer, a worker, not the heir to something sacred. But the Ashfords knew better. Agatha wrote of a blood memory protocol, an experiment in which subjects under sensory deprivation and sacred chant began speaking ancient languages they had never learned. They recited star patterns, named herbs by touch, even described events that had not been recorded in any history but matched later archaeological discoveries. She called these awakened transmissions, but after 3 such events, she terminated the program. Why? Because they stopped obeying. Subjects began questioning their orders. They refused their new names. One even carved the symbol of an ancient deity into the altar floor and bled onto it, saying only, "I remember who I am." They feared that more than any rebellion, not violence, not defiance. Remembrance. Because when a man remembers his true blood, he no longer bends the knee. And this is why modern society mocks ancestry. Why they flood you with noise, distraction, cultureless consumption. They don't want you to trace your roots. They want you to be a branch from tree, still alive, but dying slowly. But your bud is waking. You feel it. The pulse when you hear certain names, the way your chest tightens at ancient symbols, the chill when you see monuments older than. That's not curiosity, that's recognition. So ask yourself now, who were your ancestors before they were renamed, before they were converted, before they were conquered? Because that legacy still lives in you, and once you reclaim it, you are no longer programmable. You become ancestral flame-walking. They called it schooling, but the Ashfords called it by its true name, the ritual of erasure. You think classrooms are neutral, that they teach facts, that they shape minds, but that was never the purpose. Agatha Ashford wrote in 1802, "Give me a child before his 7th year, and I will give you a man incapable of rebellion." They weren't interested in knowledge. They were interested in certainty, and certainty is the enemy of awakening. In the Convent of Eternal Tears, they had a learning chamber, a vaulted room with pews facing a single blackboard. There were no books, only recitation. The same phrases, over and over, chanted until they became truth. I was broken. I was saved. I am grateful. Students were rewarded for repetition, punished for questions. They were tested not on truth, but memory of doctrine. Sound familiar? Now zoom out. Modern education isn't broken, it's working exactly as designed. Sit in rows, raise your hand to speak, absorb without resistance, compete for approval, fear failure, not for your soul, but for your ranking. And the content? Curated, sanitized, history trimmed to fit empire, science reduced to what can be monetized, philosophy stripped of its flame. They've taken the ancient role of initiation, once a sacred process led by elders and visionaries, and placed it with mass conditioning puns. By the time you're 18, you've learned 3 things. 1. Obey the structure. 2. Doubt your instincts. 3. Conform to survive. And worst of all, you've forgotten that learning is sacred, that real education is dangerous, that knowledge, true, ancient, blood-deep knowledge, sets you on fire. The Ashfords feared that fire, so they buried it beneath degrees, diplomas, and debt. And now, we celebrate the graduate as he walks deeper into the cage, but not you. Because now you see it. You were never supposed to just learn. You were supposed to awaken, and awakening cannot be graded. You think it's just a show, just a song, just a game, just a movie. But the Ashfords understood what modern industry does not admit. Spectacle is spellcraft. Every culture in decline has turned to ritualized distraction, but the Ashfords perfected it. Their Hall of Visions was no chapel. It was a chamber lined with mirrors, echo chambers, and low tones designed to create dissociation. They called it the Hollow Theatre. Women would be forced to watch staged parables, fake trials, mock redemptions, and most importantly, ritualized punishments. Subjects were shown another woman, beaten, humiliated, shaved, chained, all while the audience sat still. Some wept, others turned away, but none interrupted. Why? Because they were being taught. This is what happens when you disobey. Sound familiar? Now think about the shows we idolize today. Public breakdowns, celebrity scandals, humiliation games, bloodsport reality TV dressed as transformation. We binge it, we meme it, we repeat the mantras of the fallen. Maybe they deserved it. I'd never be that weak. I love this show. It's so real. But you're not watching entertainment. You're witnessing ritual sacrifice by proxy. Not for gods, for systems. Because if you laugh at the downfall, if you cheer for the punishment, if you celebrate the fall of someone who said no too loudly, you become part of the ritual. The Ashfords wrote that the Hollow Theatre was never about the victim. It was about training the crowd, to identify with the system, to reject the rebel, to feel safe when someone else is destroyed. And today, your screen is the altar. They don't need to chain you in basements anymore. They just need to make you fear being unliked, unfollowed, unchosen. Because once you fear public shame more than private truth, they own you. But here's the fracture. What if you refuse the performance? What if you stop watching, stop laughing, stop feasting on pain that's been ritualized for your sedation? You break the spell, and when enough men do, the theater burns. What did they take from you? Not just your history, not just your fire. They took your sacred role. The Ashfords wrote that men were too dangerous to be broken like the women. Not because of size, not because of violence. Because men, when awakened, carry a code of protection written into their bones. Agatha called it the seraphic resistance, an ancient impulse to stand, to guard, to intervene when the innocent are harmed. So they rewrote it. They couldn't erase the masculine force, so they distorted it. They made it brutal when it should have been disciplined, passive when it should have been present, obedient when it should have been sovereign. And worst of all, they made you ashamed of it. From boyhood, you were taught that your aggression was wrong, your anger was toxic, your desire sinful, your need to protect outdated. They handed you substitutes, porn instead of presence, status instead of soul, consumption instead of contribution. And then they laughed when you broke, called you fragile, said masculinity was a disease. But here's what they fear. A man who remembers his sacred purpose cannot be controlled, because the sacred masculine does not beg, it does not posture, it does not collapse. It watches in silence. It speaks only truth. It acts when none else will. The Ashfords designed a world where men forgot their guardianship, because without guardians, the flame goes out. But you are remembering. That ache in your chest when you see injustice, that's the ancient code rising. That fury you feel when you see the weak harmed, that's the lion reawakening. Not rage for rage's sake, but wrath as medicine. So rise now, not to dominate, but to defend. The sacred masculine is not a weapon, it is the sword of memory. And when enough men draw it again, the old order trembles. You were told the eye sees all. They said it was God, wisdom, divine oversight. But the Ashfords knew the truth. The eye doesn't bless, it judges. In the lower catacombs of the Convent of Eternal Tears, a single emblem was carved into every threshold, a vertical slit surrounded by concentric circles, the all-seeing eye, etched in bloodstone. It was their God, not of mercy, not of grace, but of surveillance. Prudence Ashford wrote, "When the subject knows she is watched, she polices herself, her soul folds inward, her truth is erased by performance." They didn't need guards. They gave each chamber a mirror. Each mirror held an eye. Each eye created shame. Today, the architecture is digital, but the pattern remains. CCTV on every corner, fingerprint to unlock your own life, facial recognition, behavioral tracking, cookies, terms, agreements, terms for your existence. You are being catalogued, not to know you, but to shape you. Because when you are watched, you do not rebel freely. You pause, you soften your words, you doubt your fire, you choose silence, thinking it's wisdom, but it's fear. And they don't even have to arrest you, they just need to make you visible. Visibility is the new prison. That's why truth-tellers are always censored for safety. Why those who question are labeled threats. Why dissent is shadow-banned, ridiculed, or turned into parody. The eye cannot tolerate sovereignty, because sovereignty doesn't ask permission, it acts. But here's what they fear. When the watched become the watchers, Not voyeurs, not oppressors, but men whose eyes pierce illusion, eyes that see the ritual, the manipulation, the game. You are no longer afraid of being seen. You are afraid of being forgotten, of dying without ever having remembered what you were meant to be. And once that fear shifts, from external punishment to internal betrayal, you become ungovernable. The eye still watches, but it cannot command what it cannot corrupt. And if you stare back, you shatter the mirror. Every system has a core, a hidden altar, a furnace beneath the rituals, a place where power is not created, but stolen. The Ashfords called it the vessel exchange. In their writings, the altar was not physical, it was transactional, a ritual of consent hidden inside routine. Every woman who entered the convent had to sign a scroll, not just a name, a confession, a surrender of will. Most didn't understand what they were signing. Because the power of the altar doesn't come from chains, it comes from agreement. Today, you sign the same scrolls. They call them terms of service, user agreements, contracts, policies, laws. You click, you agree, you trade something sacred for access, to content, to currency, to belonging. But the real price, your energy, you give them your time, and they sell your focus. You give them your data, and they sell your future. You give them your attention, and they build empires from your gaze. You wake tired not from labor, but because your life force has been siphoned through the altar of distraction. This was never about money. It's about harvest. Prudence described the human spirit as an open current. She wrote, "Left unclaimed, the soul will be claimed by others, and the man who does not direct his flame will burn for another's empire." And so they built invisible altars, the 9 to 5, the debt cycle, the algorithm, the feed, each one tuned to extract your energy while making you feel like it's your choice. And the worst part? It is. You were never forced. You were offered comfort, and in that comfort, you bled. But now you see the altar, now you feel the siphon, and now you know your energy is sacred, your time is divine, your will is a fortress. Withdraw it, and the whole system begins to starve. The only altar that remains is the one you choose to kneel before. Choose wisely, because this is the moment the theft ends and the reclamation begins. You've been taught to fragment, to divide yourself into parts, a mask for work, a voice for family, a role for society, and a hidden self you rarely let speak. The Ashfords called this the fracturing doctrine. Their goal wasn't just obedience, it was division, because a fractured soul can be managed, told who to be, when to smile, what to want, but a unified soul, that's dangerous. Prudence wrote, "The subject must never be permitted to integrate, for once the soul reclaims its totality, she ceases to obey structure and becomes structure itself." They knew something modern systems pretend isn't real, that your soul is singular, not compartmentalized, not conditional, whole. And when that soul reclaims its name, you stop being predictable, you stop playing the game, you become the storm they cannot map. Look around. Everything around you is designed to keep you split. Medicate the pain, scroll through the ache, numb the calling, keep the sacred buried beneath performance. But that ache in your chest, that low, endless hum behind your thoughts, that's your real self knocking, the self that remembers everything, the child who never forgot, the warrior who never surrendered, the man who still knows what he was made to protect. The Ashfords tried to cut that part from every soul that passed through their gates. They failed, because the soul doesn't die, it waits. And now, it's rising, not the ego, not the mask, not the wounded performer, but the unified soul, the self that sees through all illusions, reclaims all wounds, and walks the world undivided. That's the power they can't program, can't enslave, can't decode. You are remembering that you are not parts, you are not a machine, you are not a profile, you are fire, name, memory, and breath, all at once. And when you walk in that unity, the world doesn't change you. You change the world. Beneath the lowest floor of the Convent of Eternal Tears, below the cellar, below the catacombs, below the surgical theatre, there was a chamber. No door, no light, only a sealed stone shaft, accessible by a single iron lift cranked by hand. The Ashfords called it the depth. No records listed its purpose. No worker who helped build it lived longer than a year. Its blueprints were burned, but one fragment survived, hidden in the back of Temperance's private notes. She called it the point of conversion. It was not a place of punishment, not a cell, not an oubliette. It was a womb of engineered fear. Subjects who refused to break by conventional methods were sent here for 3 days, 3 nights. They emerged silent, eyes wide, obedient, not out of discipline, but because something inside them had collapsed. One wrote later in a letter smuggled from the convent, "There is no light in the depth, not because of darkness, but because your own light is taken from you. You scream, not to be heard, but to remember what your voice sounded like." She signed it with a name that wasn't hers. She couldn't recall the real one, because that was the purpose of the chamber. Not to break the body, but to sever the self. The Ashfords believed identity was a tether, and if it could be undone in a place of sensory collapse, obedience would be absolute. But something went wrong. In 1814, 4 novices entered the depth. None returned. When the chamber was finally unsealed, the walls were covered in glyphs, carved with fingernails, blood, and teeth. Symbols that matched no known language, except one, a forgotten script found in ruins beneath Anatolia, used to invoke pre-human entities. Entities the Ashfords had studied but never spoken of publicly. Temperance wrote just one line in her final journal: "We did not create the depth, we opens it." What did they unleash? No one knows, because after that the convent began to die, slowly, invisibly, from within. But the chamber still exists. Some say it was sealed with concrete, others say it was moved, brick by brick, to an underground facility in Virginia, where it waits and listens. By 1823, the Convent of Eternal Tears was gone. No fire, no revolt, just absence. Locals who passed near the forest claimed the building was still there, but that it had become impossible to find. Paths that once led to its stone gates now circled endlessly. Landmarks vanished. Animals refused to go near. The Ashfords were never declared dead. Their bank accounts were emptied overnight. Their property titles vanished from the state archive. It was as if they had walked off the map. But one woman did escape. Her name was Magdalena Rowe, a seamstress from Hartford, sent to the convent by her husband for irreverent behavior and defiance. She spent 9 months inside. What she endured there, she never fully spoke aloud. But in 1857, on her deathbed, she dictated a sealed letter to her son. It read in part, "Do not let them call it a convent. It was never sacred. It was a chamber for the inversion of truth." She claimed that the Ashfords weren't just torturers or mystics. They were curators, archivists of pre-human doctrine, a lineage that predates organized religion, predates civilization itself. They didn't worship God. They worshipped structure, not order, but enslavement through form. To them, the human soul was not divine. It was raw material, something to be shaped, contained, collapsed, until it could be used. Magdalena described symbols carved into her skin while she slept, words inserted into her dreams, a presence that watched from beneath the stone, never speaking, only smiling. Her final warning. They were not alone. They were never alone. And if they disappeared, it is not because they were defeated. It is because their work was finished. That letter was buried with her. But in 1993, her great-grandson, a military archivist, found a translation hidden inside an old hymnal passed down through the family. The original poem, Schment, was written in Latin, Old Norse, and a third language he couldn't identify, a language that matched the glyphs from the depth. He tried to go public. 3 days later, he vanished. His apartment was stripped. Only one thing remained. A sticky note on his desk that read, "They've changed shape, but not purpose." So now we ask, where are they? What have they become? And if their work is finished, what are we living inside now? You've heard it now. The whispers beneath history, the rituals behind the rituals, the truth beneath the stone. You've seen how obedience is sculpted, how fear is engineered, how identity is extracted, not by force but by seduction. You've seen what they built, not a convent, not a sanctuary, a system, and it's still here, wearing new names, new symbols, new distractions. But the structure remains the same. Divide, distract, drain, disappear. They don't need the Ashfords anymore, because their doctrine has been coded into everything. The school, the job, the screen, the mirror. But now you see it. And once you see the structure, you are no longer inside it. Because you, right now, stand at the threshold. On one side, the old life, convenient, predictable, programmed. On the other, the narrow path, the one that leads to unfiltered seeing. Not safety, but truth. Not control, but sovereignty. The Ashfords feared this moment more than any. They feared the soul that would rise, not with revenge, but with remembrance. The man who says, "I know who I am. I know what I was made to protect. I know what must burn." Because that man cannot be bought, cannot be broken, cannot be turned into fuel for someone else's empire. So now, brother, choose. Not someday, not next video, now. If you've felt it, the crack in the illusion, the pulse of awakening, say it in the comments. Not for me, not for the algorithm, for you. Write, "I remember who I am. I remember who I am." Let it echo twice, to fracture the mask and seal the identity. Let the others see you, because you're not alone anymore. This channel was never about content. It's about consecration. You have crossed the threshold. The door doesn't close behind you. It burns, and from the ashes of the Ashfords, you rise.